said I would mention some of the genres of comedy, and this is just a few of them. There are more than this. But there's dark comedy, which was once upon a time called black comedy. What dark comedy does is it makes light of a serious subject, such as war. And you probably won't remember this, but there was a film version of MASH that was a comedy making fun of war, and then Pulp Fiction is a dark comedy that makes fun of crime, and Fight Club is a dark comedy that makes fun of violence. And I'm a big fan of dark comedy. I like laughing at things that you're not supposed to laugh at. Generally speaking, I think there's nothing we're not supposed to laugh at, but again, that's a personal position. Another type of comedy is burlesque. I'm not going to really get into that. There's romantic comedies, which you know a lot about because rom-coms are very popular nowadays. And then this one, for some reason, isn't capitalized, but satire is another form of comedy. And satire ridicules human behavior, makes fun of the way humans behave. Molière, who I mentioned earlier, the French playwright, wrote a play called Tartuffe, and it's all about religious hypocrisy. And then Shaw's Arms and the Man, that's George Bernard Shaw, is a comedy of satiring, poking fun at the glorification of war. And then there's Oscar Wilde's play, The Importance of Being Earnest, and it pokes fun at the British upper classes. That's satire. I enjoy satire quite a bit as well. There's also slapstick, and this slapstick depends on physical pain and humiliation to get people to laugh. So someone slipping on a banana peel is a form of slapstick. If you've ever laughed at someone in the cafeteria dropping a tray of dishes, you're laughing at slapstick. There's also a German word for that called Schadenfreude, which is enjoying the misery of someone else. That's for a different class. Slapstick is widely considered the least sophisticated form of comedy. I don't always agree with that in general, but children usually understand slapstick comedy. It's one of the ones they get first. And then the film Home Alone is an example of slapstick, and much of the early Three Stooges is all slapstick. There's political comedy, which is generally speaking a subset of satire, but it's almost its own little entity. Farce is what we really generally think of when we think of most comedy films nowadays. And farce depends on wildly improbable plots to be performed at a breakneck speed. It's really making the audience not think about anything too deeply, because if they thought about it too deeply, they'd realize just how ridiculous the situation is. But often in a farce, there's mistaken identity that is key to the story. And I think farce is a brilliant if it's done well. I mean, and there are quite a number of farces that are brilliantly done, and there are a lot of farces, in my opinion, again just my opinion, that totally miss the mark. So most films that are in cinemas that claim to be comedies are of somewhere in the farce nature, and I generally find them to be horribly done. But every once in a while, something like Bridesmaids or something like The Hangover comes along, and I know most of you are too young to remember those films, but they're really well done. Farce is usually considered only slightly more sophisticated than slapstick. It gets no respect. However, oddly, two of the most highly regarded comedy films of all time, matter of fact, they usually ranked the first and second of best comedy films of all time, are farces, and that's Some Like It Hot from 1959 and Tootsie from 1982. They're brilliantly done. Now, another form of comedy is screwball comedy. Farce relies on improbable circumstances. Screwball comedy is dependent upon improbable characters. The characters that we meet in a screwball comedy are just way out there. They are nothing like we would expect to meet in any normal circumstances. Oftentimes, you meet screwball characters in any of these types of comedy. In a screwball comedy, it's mostly just screwball characters. Parody is when you're imitating a serious genre, but you're kind of making fun of it. So if you've ever seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, that's making fun of the King Arthur legend. And if you've seen Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein, that's making fun of the horror films of the 1930s. And just as a little side note, both of those movies were made into successful Broadway musicals. And then Broadway musical comedy is another type of comedy, although generally speaking, a musical comedy really is one of the other forms of comedy done as a musical. So, and I think I've kind of mentioned this, a play or a film or a book or anything is rarely a single genre. So one of my favorite movies, The Big Lebowski, is a screwball comedy that relies heavily on dark comedy and has many elements of slapstick in it. Another genre is melodrama. If when you hear the term melodrama, you think of something like these two pictures that are shown here, which, you know, has the good guy, the villain, the damsel in distress, the this, you know, that's was a type of play that made popular sometime in the mid 1800s and kind of lasted up through the mid 1900s. It was called melodrama, but that was a type of theater, not necessarily a genre of plays. So, in the purest sense, a melodrama is a play that has a serious subject, but the characters are more loosely drawn than in tragedy. So they are characters that the audience can easily identify with. Good guy, bad guy, heroine, you know, woman with the heart of gold. Characters that we understand and recognize immediately, and usually because of that, we can have an immediate, strong attachment and response to them. So if you remember, in a tragedy, things must happen absolutely honestly. Everything that must happen will happen. In a melodrama, elements of chance and coincidence are almost required to happen. Somebody comes in with something at the last seconds that saves the day, or someone discovers something by accident that changes the events of the play. This is all very common. In a melodrama, yeah, there may be emotions of pity and such, but generally speaking, a melodrama is working on the level of sentimentality, right? It is trying to tug at your heartstrings, and maybe there's a little, you know, it might cause you to fear things a little bit. It might cause you to be scared a little bit, but it's really on a superficial level. When you're watching a melodrama, you know everything's going to turn out okay. And then, unlike a tragedy, in a melodrama, at the end of the play, there is no catharsis, there's no great enlightenment. At most, and this is true of most melodramas, good wins out over evil. That's about it.
One of the most common forms of melodrama nowadays are the cop shows on TV. So if you look at Law and Order SVU, you know exactly what kind of cop Olivia was, exactly what kind of cop Elliot was. They were stock characters. Then there's the funny cop and there's the intellectual cop. and then you have good guys and you have bad guys. Normally, somewhere about 3/4 of the way through the episode, maybe even closer to the end than that, they discover some piece of evidence that solves the crime. It is a melodramatic moment, and then the good guys win. Normally, occasionally they let the bad guys win, but that was an anomaly.